I know you guys like shipping and logistics, but do you like to snack? If so, the host of the Shipping Pod has a brand new podcast. Fast snacks, fast food, fast reviews. Snack Masters Inc., a podcast served to you in 30 minutes or less. Available now at snackmastersinc.com, iTunes, Google Play, and everywhere podcasts are heard. Enjoy Season 2 of The Shipping Pod.
Prepare for takeoff, please.
It's the Shipping Pod. Season 2. Back in the saddle again, my friends. Season 2 is upon us. And damn, does it feel good to be sitting here in this chair. It just feels right. Man, so much has happened since our last show. There's been terrorist attacks. There's been hurricanes. There's been port disruption. Our president may or may not be off the rails, or could just be golfing. Who knows? My son turned 3. The other one turned 1. Now they're dominating the house, throwing toys in the dog food bowl. It's madness over here. Oh, geez. Oh, I'm still doing my fitness pal. I lost 25 pounds. Then I gained 10 pounds. Then I lost 15 more pounds. So I think that nets to what? 30 pounds? Still a little bit more to go. But I am getting near my fighting weight, and I'm ready to go, guys. I even saw Corey Feldman live and in concert, and it was everything you hoped and dreamed it would be. Except for the fact that he didn't play the song, Go For It, the song that made him a viral sensation and got him on this tour to begin with. What's up with that, Corey Feldman? I was your defender. I was on your side. I was happy when Billy Bush went down. Billy Bush bullied you, and then you got caught on that bus with Trump over there. I got your back, but you didn't get mine. You didn't play Go For It. So I don't know if I'll ever be going to a Corey Feldman concert again. I did watch The Lost Boys the other night, though. And it still holds up. Season 2 is going to be fantastic. Today we're covering the Jones Act and intercoastal shipping, digital disruption and how tech is altering the supply chain, consulting and how 4PLs and 3PLs work, container homes, slave labor, ELDs, those are electronic logging devices and their effects on the trucking industry, headhunters, the new era of big ships, blockchain and new data tech, cybersecurity, and why your supply chain could be at risk. This season's going to have it all, so stay tuned. For new listeners to the show, you can head over to theshippingpod.com for all of our current and old episodes from Season 1. In addition, we're on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Can't forget Twitter, all at The Shipping Pod. Listen to us on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and everywhere podcasts are heard. There are 2 ways to give back to the show. The first is to simply go on iTunes, rate and review the show. We've got 35 of them. We are the highest rated logistics podcast on iTunes. Thanks to you. You can also visit our Patreon. That's patreon.com/theshippingpod, patreon.com/theshippingpod. Patreon is a site where you, the listener, can contribute back to the show in any denomination you would like. There are various perks involved. Check it out over there. See what the different tier levels are. I'd love to hear from you. And if you want to contact me directly, you can do so at info@theshippingpod.com. I would love to hear from you, and I will answer any questions that you may have on the air. Now, we mentioned a ton of things have happened, and one of those was hurricane season. Hurricanes blew across the United States and hit Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, which, note to Donald Trump, you are the president of the Virgin Islands.
And I went to Puerto Rico, and I met with the president of the Virgin Islands.
And to think, Dan Quayle just couldn't spell potato. Well, big issue that has been on the news, the Jones Act. And the Jones Act has been on the news because of aid being sent over to Puerto Rico or the inability to send it there. The news media has run with the story saying that ships can't get over there. They'd love to bring all this aid. There was a 10-day waiver, etc., etc. Well, what is the Jones Act? Is any of that true? Today's guest is going to clear all of that up because his company is entrenched in, guess what? The Jones Act. And by guest, I mean Percy Pyne. He is the founding partner of Green Shipping Line. He hails from a family with a legendary history in transportation. Mr. Pyne has been involved in the shipping world for more than 25 years. He has also invested his time and family's resources towards recreating the U.S. short sea feeder system that existed prior to 1956. And if you recall back to our episode on the origin of the shipping container, you may recall that one of the first ships was the Ideal X, and that had its maiden voyage from Newark to Houston. Well, that's intercoastal shipping, and the Jones Act basically states that U.S.-built, U.S.-flagged vessels are the only ships that can transport goods intercoastally along the United States. So, the issue that came up here with Puerto Rico, for example, is that may potentially inhibit some trade. If that's true or not, we're going to cover, but in concept, so if something were coming from China, let's say it's coming from Shanghai, and it goes to New York, that ship returning from New York cannot take goods from New York and drop them off in Puerto Rico because they're not a U.S. flag ship, and that would be considered domestic trade. That is the issue right there. So it has to be a U.S. flag ship. That's what the Jones Act covers. There's not a lot of container shipping going along in the United States. It's just not done here. It's a big deal in Europe. It's a bigger deal in China. It's in other places of the world. It used to be here in the United States, but things have changed and times have changed too. We're going to find out why with our next guest. This is a phone-in. So if the sound quality drops a little, it's not your headphones. It's not your ear pods. It's not your car stereo. It's just that we had to do this over VoIP. I think the recording still came out pretty well. Give it a listen. Without further ado, Percy Pyne, founding partner, GSL, Green Shipping Lines. I'm here today with Percy Pyne of GSL. Percy is trying to bring back intercoastal shipping as a viable option to shippers in the United States. Now, Percy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Tim, for the opportunity.
Tell me a little bit about where you're at now, physically, because you're not up in the Northeast with us. You're down in Florida, I believe, correct?
Yes, sir. Tequesta, Florida, or Jupiter, Florida, and enjoying the weather for the moment.
Yeah, well, but were you hit with the hurricanes that had blown through last month?
Yes, we were indirectly affected. We got winds of about 100 to 125 mile an hour gusts, but our part of Florida was spared as the storm shifted west, so we didn't get the brunt of it. But our problem here was mostly lack of supplies and power, which became a real problem after 4 or 5 days for many, many families.
Well, Percy, as Luca Bloom once sang, you couldn't have come at a better time. And I say that because I think it was maybe a month and a half ago. It was actually before the hurricanes that you had contacted me, and we talked about maybe having you as a guest on here. And one of the topics that had come up is one that had not been in the mainstream media for a long time, at least as far as I recall, and is all over the place and in everyone's mind now due to Puerto Rico, which is the Jones Act. Can you tell me a little bit about your involvement, your experience with the Jones Act and why we were having that conversation in the context of your company?
Sure. Thank you. The Jones Act is no different than arbitrage laws of 40 some odd of our trading partners. Jones Act is a flag of preference order, if you will. The original Jones Act was in 1793. The latest one, the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, is just the ongoing saga in the repetitiveness of this particular legislation. Countries with coastlines have preferences that they try to protect their coasts with their own ships. And the Jones Act is partly empowered to do that. The Jones Act requires, very simply, that a vessel be assembled in the United States. The vessel must be flagged in the United States, which is not as inexpensive as Liberia or some of the coast of the countries of convenience, and it must be crewed by American crews. So, in general, the 5 maritime universities that support sending officers and sailors to the Jones Act trade are responsible for moving goods in and around our country. The United States is blessed with the longest coastlines in the world and the most extensive river system in the world, and we have a very, very developed port system, which we believe can be used to a greater extent than it is today. Just going back all the way, the birth of the country, all the 13 colonies had a water landing, if you will, or parts of their coasts were underwater. And there was a reason for that, and that was because simply nothing could move because we didn't have roads or rails. So coastal shipping is nothing new to the world. It was the thoroughfare of choice, frankly, that built this country, and it was the pattern of development that built this country. So this is the Jones Act is just the last iteration of a long, long history of maritime trades.
Percy, I don't mean to cut you off, but last season we did a show on the origin of the shipping container, and in that we covered the Ideal X and its maiden voyage from Newark down to Houston, and how coastal shipping, it's sort of what's old is new again. And the reason we were going to have this conversation wasn't necessarily just to talk about what coastal shipping was or what the Jones Act was, although you did inform me very strongly on those. But before we dive too deep, just give a brief summary of what GSL is. What are you guys trying to do?
From 50,000 feet, we're trying to move cargoes from, let's say, Boston to New York, and from New York to Savannah. Those cargoes that are either domestic or imports and exports have to move between U.S. ports on a U.S.-built, flagged, and crewed ship. So in Europe, there are 2,000 of these little Federal Express trucks that move things from Hamburg to Copenhagen, etc., St. Petersburg. In Asia, because there aren't developed roads and railroads to the extent that we have them, there are about 6,000 of these little trucks running around. In the United States, there's exactly 0. So what we're trying to do is to bring back what we had up until 1986, let's say, was the last time it was really significantly traded here in the United States. We're just trying to restore what is commonly known as the American Marine Highway and Traffic, move it back to the coasts, move it between ports, and because 90% of our population lives within 100 to 125 miles of navigable water, we're just moving the can or the cargo down the road on the water to the farthest point we can and to the nearest point to its destination. So to do that, we have to have American-built ships, we have to have American crews, and we have to have an American flag, all of which comply with the Jones Act.
So what does coastal shipping look like right now? Because I think when people think of shipping, of course, we always think of the big container ships and a shipment coming from, let's say, Beijing to the port of New York. I guess with coastal shipping, what happens there, though, and what some people may not be aware of, is when that ship arrives, it couldn't go to New York, pick up some cargo there, and bring it along to, let's say, Boston, right? That would be in violation of the Jones Act.
That is correct.
Or more topically in the news with Puerto Rico, one of the issues that sort of came up is people said, well, why, with the ships coming in from China, can't you put aid from New York or Jacksonville or wherever onto the boat, and that can bring it back on its return voyage? The Jones Act is what inhibits something like that from happening, correct?
Theoretically, yes. But I would answer a different way than maybe some of the other people have. The way that coastal shipping or international shipping works now is like an international airline. They have routes and they have schedules. So your big ship that comes into New York unloads 5,000 boxes. It's going to continue on to its next scheduled port. to your example of a ship coming in, let's say to a Savannah or Jacksonville, and then changing its rotation to take cargo to Puerto Rico, they'd have to change their worldwide rotation to do that, number one. And number two, you have to assume that there's cargo to bring to Puerto Rico, which frankly, because it's just in Jacksonville, isn't necessarily the case. And then shipping company, you'd have to be able to pick up a load in Puerto Rico and fill up your vessel to go on to the next stop. So the idea that people would take vessels out of their normal service is a bit past what we think would have happened, because it would mean that they were giving up, number one, their schedule, and number two, cargo. And the fact is that not one foreign ship actually took up the offer to move cargo from the United States to Puerto Rico. It just didn't happen, and it wouldn't happen because there's plenty of American tonnage on the Puerto Rican run already.
Yeah, there was a lot of misinformation, I think, out there, and it seemed like a lot of media outlets ran with basically the same story that was, in essence, vilifying the Jones Act. And then you had some radical statements on both sides, but one of them, and I think that it kind of confuses people, and it certainly confused me at first, especially when I looked into it, but they said, well, Jones Act defenders, or at least some Jones Act defenders said, well, there's 40,000 U.S. flagged vessels. But when you actually look at container ships, for example, there's really far less than that, correct? There's maybe 100, maybe less than that.
About 35.
Yeah, so even less, a third of my guesstimation. So what does coastal shipping look like right now in the United States? What exactly is the Jones Act protecting? What are we using it for?
Well, the Jones Act protects about 500,000 jobs in the country a year. It protects shipbuilding in the country. It protects the investment that Americans, not foreigners, have in these vessels, whether they're 35 or they're any with the 40-some-odd thousand Jones Act vessels. And we have a significant investment in those vessels. And if they were to eliminate the Jones Act, all the foreign tonnage, with this excess foreign tonnage, all the foreigners would just take over our trades. It's no different than China. They protect their vessels and their investment and their sailors. We do ours. Germany does it. If you have a German flag, you must have German officers on the bridge. Everybody has their own quote-unquote Jones Act, if you want the flag of convenience. But what the news outlets were really saying is the Jones Act, if you took it away, everything is cured. Well, that's not the case. It won't cure everything. It won't cure anything, actually, in my opinion. It'll just mean that the country will lose minimum 500,000 jobs. There's no reason to have the 5 maritime academies if you're not going to have a place for the young cadets to go. There's really no reason to build in the United States, because arguably our vessels are a little bit more expensive, or a lot more expensive as the case may be. There's significant financial downstream impacts that eliminating the Jones Act would have. Now, you do pluses and minuses, and I don't think the press did a very good, with all due respect. I think maybe they should dig deeper and do a plus and minuses. What are you gaining? What are you giving up? And I think when you do that analysis, it becomes very apparent very quickly that eliminating this basically eliminates American jobs.
Well, you have done that analysis as well. You've looked at what the routing is, and well, you believe in the Jones Act. You believe that it's being underutilized, right? Because
yes,
with these 35 container ships, it could be bigger. There could be more. There could be more to it, and potentially there could be routing to some of these areas that feel it's disadvantageous. Because one of the things that comes up in the Jones Act is the places that seem to feel that they're being hurt are the non-contiguous United States, places like Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, Hawaii, who don't have the same service that the mainland would have, because there's 2 companies really, right? Horizon and Matson are the 2 basically U.S. flagged ships, right?
No, Tim, with respect, it's a really, really good question, and thank you for asking it. What's happening in the world in our world here is, I think, instructive of what will happen in the future. The non-contiguous trades are serviced by Matson no longer exists, Horizon no longer exists. So you've got Tote, you've got Crowley, you've got Keystone, and several others and Pasha that service Guam, Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and maybe some territories in the Caribbean. There is excess tonnage in all of those. In other words, there's more capacity in those lanes than can be filled. And what's happening now is a renewal of those fleets. It's really interesting what's going on with Tote at NASCO. They're ordering ships. Tote is ordering ships to replace the older ships. And they're doing it at a record pace, one that we haven't seen in the last 20 years. Crowley is also renewing its fleet to go to Puerto Rico. So there's a significant sea change within the Jones Act carriers to renew their vessels or their fleets. When that happens, there's a trickle-down effect, in our opinion, that will suddenly people will say, well, our equipment is 40 and 50 years old. It isn't state-of-the-art. It isn't economical. It isn't fuel efficient. And it certainly is in many cases too old to really be sailing. So what they're doing is they're starting to look at their fleets and say, how are we going to look at the next 30 years? But if I could, and I don't want to dominate this, but if I can go back to your example of the big ship coming into New York, what happens today is really interesting. Today, they drop 3,000 or 4,000 boxes and take 3,000 or 4,000 boxes or cargo, whatever, on, and then they leave. Those pieces of cargo are distributed two ways today. One by trucks. So if you have 5,000 boxes, that means 5,000 trucks. And remember, these are coming every day. Or they go by rail. In Europe, they use, because they've been doing it, they adopted this system in the early 90s and have just been expanding it over the last 30 years. 40% of those containers that would have gotten off in Newark in your ship will be distributed in Europe by water to the next destination, not by truck, not by rail. So Europe mix is 40% what we call transshipped, which would be if you took it off in New York and you took it up to Boston, that would be a transshipment. 40% are by rail and 20% are by truck. Asia is actually an even more significant statistic. 60% of all cargoes that move in and out of hub ports are by water, marine transportation. Our number is zero. So it's this huge opportunity for the country to use its vast highways, which frankly nobody are using at the moment, which is what we're trying to do, and it's unlimited capacity. So you add the third mode, look at the water, add capacity.
So right now, if you are a shipper and you are, let's say, based up in New York and you want to send a 40-foot container down to Florida, do you have the option, aside from truck and rail, is there an option to even go by vessel that's viable, or if it even exists?
No, sir, it doesn't exist.
Coastal shipping used to exist, right? It used to be a thing. Why did the United States get away from it?
I can give you my opinion. I'm sure that everybody has their own. There were a couple of things that happened all at the same time. 56, the Interstate Highway Trust Fund was created by Eisenhower, and in 57, Mr. McLean invented, quote unquote, invented the container with the X vessels. Why didn't it develop as it did in Europe? Because the military co-opted all the Mr. McLean's vessels for Vietnam, and that's probably the reason, one of the reasons, seminal reason that we don't have coastal shipping today. Then what happened in 1986, the Reagan administration deregulated trucking, changed the tax code, and started Star Wars. So people started focusing not on building ships, but on actually building military assets, which were much more lucrative for them. And hence, we shifted away from coastal shipping. 56, I believe that about 34% to 35% of all cargo in the United States was shifted by water, and now that is 2%. You know, what an opportunity to go back and use it if we can get there.
Yeah, so coastal shipping does exist. There's still some going on. So what does the marketplace look like right now? What is moving back and forth? Is it mostly minerals or oil, that kind of thing, going to Alaska or Guam, as you mentioned?
What's occurring? What's occurring there? What's the routing?
The routing is of oil out of Houston up to the East Coast, minerals, grain, a considerable amount of grain, asphalt, stone, anything that we make domestically that we have to put on, let's say a bulker, which is a freighter, if you will, which is bulk cargo, is moved around the United States. I think we have 74% of the wheat market in the world. It moves through New Orleans. It's all done on American Jones Act barges. I mean, that's a pretty significant export. So those are the kind of things that are moved on the water in our fleets, but we don't have any coastal container ships, pure coastal container ships.
That seems, and we're going to get to that because your company is looking to change that, because it seems a bit odd to me that option doesn't exist, especially if you've tried to book a few trucking shipments lately. Spot rates are through the roof. J.B. Hunt estimates that rates could be up more than 20% next year. There's a number of contributors to that strained capacity due to the hurricanes, but there's something even bigger, and that's the ELDs, the electronic logging device mandate that's coming up, which is going to change the dynamic of trucking. It doesn't change any laws aside from the sense that you have to have these devices in your trucks. But now the hours of service that the Department of Transportation has, that 14 hours has to be enforced. You can't flub logs on paperwork. And it's a kind of an unsaid secret that's definitely going on in the trucking world. That's why there's going to be so much disruption by these ELDs. What do you foresee happening in the trucking space coming up in 2018 and moving forward?
I can only give you my opinion. Others are much more qualified. I believe in the trucking industry that the drivers will get paid a lot more, significantly more. The truck prices will obviously correspondingly increase. I believe that because of the new law that some of the DCs are going to be just outside of the one-day trip limit. So one-day trips are going to turn into 2 trips, which again, Tim, as you know, will just increase the price of trucking. Maybe it's time to increase the price of trucking. Maybe it's time to get some tax revenue to help fix the roads. Something will have to happen. I just think it's going to get more expensive to truck things, period.
It definitely seems like it's going that way. That's the direction, at least the pricing's moving in. And again, the hurricanes are going to go away. But these ELDs, at least in the, for the short term at least, or maybe even the long term, are definitely going to change that. And because they have to be more honest in their logs, that's going to extend days, like you said. And the less turns a trucker can do, the higher the rates go up, because it's all based on capacity and demand, right?
Correct. So you're absolutely correct. So people are now starting to look at the problem and say, okay, well, how are we going to deal with the existing capacity, let alone the capacity that we'll need to grow and as the population grows? And we believe that we have the answer. There's a great big highway out there. It's blue and it's wet, and if you use it, we'll become like we were before, and the rest of the world is now. We will play one mode of transportation off against the other. So we believe that coastal shipping ultimately will bring down price of shipments, simply because it's cheaper to ship by water than it is in the other form.
So this would be a good lead into what it is that you aim to do with GSL. What option do you want to give shippers now, and what's the cost viability of that, and the time viability of that, and how does it work? What do you guys aim to achieve here?
Well, the first goal is to get people to understand what it is. It's hard to realize, and that people don't know what coastal shipping is. But it's a very simple thing. It's what we did the best of in the world for centuries. And once they realize that there's something out there, well, okay, here's a ship. And we were the first ones to put a ship in the water. It was American feeder lined. We pulled it down after 7 months, not for lack of cargo, but because Congress didn't pass a legislation that we had going. But and this is a perfect example. We'd go into Portland with a vessel, and people would say, well, I can truck it to Boston. We said, well, no, we can put it on this vessel. We'll take it to Boston, or from Halifax down. And people would say, well, why would we do it that way? I don't know. Because it's available to you. We didn't know we could do that, and we don't want to change what we're doing, because if you aren't successful in delivering it, I'm going to get blamed, which is, I think, the biggest hurdle that we all have to get over in this country. If coastal shipping is to be successful, people are going to have to start looking at it. And so our first endeavor will be between New York and Boston, which we think is the most visible corridor in the country, because we think it has, maybe I-95 has the heaviest loads, if you will, or almost constant gridlock. We would take something from Conley and we would come through the Massachusetts Canal, which saves 10 hours of sailing, and come down north of Long Island and down the East River and across to Newark. That would be our first run, and then we would go back to Boston. We would then add New Bedford, which is a huge fishing mecca, if you will, processing, and within 15 miles of all the DCs between Providence and Boston, huge. So those DCs are importing lots of goods from the Far East and Europe, and they're sending back things like fish, etc. And that would be our backhaul, if you will, or head haul, depending on how you look at it. But people have to focus on the fact that this exists.
Well, when we were having this discussion, and you mentioned all these stops that you're going to add along the way, a light bulb went off in my head. And I said, wow, that sounds like a freight subway system. That's actually a great idea, as long as it functions better than the MBTA here in Boston. But, that's over 100 years old, so the delays and fires and everything. But a freight subway system would be fantastic, because it gives people, not just coastally, but I guess intercoastally, it would give them more options, because they could export out of Newark instead of exporting out of Boston. Out of Boston, you only have the choice of, I believe, 5 vessels right now. Or out of Newark, the sky's the limit, and they just raise the Bayonne Bridge. They get some of the mega vessels in there. You have more cost options. You can save money and time, not just shipping, intercoastally, but then internationally as well, right?
Correct. Your analogy of a subway is both what we're going to adopt and fascinating. That's what it is. It's a reliable service. In Europe, all of the countries are connected by these little services that go from here to there. And in Asia, it's the only way they can bring goods to the hubs. Hub is, for instance, Newark, where there are 28 different services coming in, 28 different companies coming in and out. So that's ultimately what happens, is that the shippers, once they realize they have this option, they can get on a subway, they can get on a bus, or they can walk. I'm not going to tell you which one I think is walking, but they then compare the 3 modes, and whoever gives them the best price is the person that, or the shipper that gets the cargo. Because America hasn't gone yet through the container revolution, it will, and when it does, then coastal shipping will become even more important.
What's involved with setting up a port to get it to accept coastal shipping? Are there different parameters than international shipping? Do you have to use different longshoremen? What goes into that may make the logistics either easier or potentially more difficult?
Actually, the ports can handle it today. What they have to do is get a shore crane, if they don't have a shore crane. But the ports we're going to go into have gantries, big cranes that are already there. The original cities that we're looking at all have the equipment. It's the same labor. It's ILA all the way up and down. You just accept that fact, because you want qualified and skilled professionals to be doing it. The ports are ready to go. We don't need to add anything to Boston. We don't need to add anything to Newark. We don't need to add anything to Norfolk, Savannah, Charleston, Canaveral, Miami. Everything's there. You could do it tomorrow if we had ships.
You're mentioning these smaller or underutilized ports. Not only could you revive some of those areas, especially, New Bedford or a place like that, but many other areas, because you're giving shippers new strategies on where to put distribution centers and where to put some of their hubs, because now they don't necessarily have to be exactly on the freeway corridor or on the main shipping port corridor, because the connecting subway system, the freight subway system, is right there, right?
That is correct, sir. That's why New Bedford, Newport, or Quonset, Newark, Philadelphia, that's why they're where they are. They're on the water. They're on the water. Henry Ford shipped everything by water.
I was going to say, you had just mentioned ships, as long as you had the ship. So what's the hurdle there? Part of the Jones Act, and I think we mentioned it, but if we didn't, just to reiterate, is that it has to be a U.S.-built ship, correct?
Correct.
And who's manufacturing those? How would you go about sourcing the vessels to handle this?
Well, in the existing system, there are only 4 major shipyards left in the United States, and none of them have any capacity to do anything until the end of 18. So they're out. So what we've done is to co-opt the German-Dutch system of kits, and we're attempting to set up a kit factory in the United States. And what happens is, because the Jones Act is very specific on what can be done in the United States, what has to be done in the United States, the steel has to be fabricated and assembled in the United States. Kits are not a new idea. We produced 5,000 vessels in 3 years in the Second World War. They built all of the Liberty ships, and and a great deal of the subsequent vessels were built out of kits, all sourced in the United States. So this is not a new idea for the United States. It's actually just the next generation or 3 generations later in the United States that we're trying to reproduce. Just like the Liberty ships, they were doing 3 a day. We won't be able to do that, but we will focus on building our kit factory and then going to regional shipyards, which are smaller shipyards, which are struggling for work now, Tim. And we will say, here's a kit, assemble a vessel for us. And so that will put that many more people back to work. But in today's world, you don't need a big shipyard to build small ships. You can build them on land and roll them into the water like they do in the Netherlands or in Germany. And it's frankly easier and cheaper to build them on land and just roll them in than it is to use a graving dock. That's the way the system works in the rest of the world today is they assemble kits. So that's what we plan to do.
I know that there's been some discussion, because again, the Jones Act has been in the news, in altering it. And one of the provisions some people have talked about altering was removing the U.S.-built requirement, because some estimates have U.S.-built ships costing 3 times as much as foreign-built ships. Do you think that that's necessary, or do you think that's only because the industry isn't being fed right now? So that's part of why it costs so much money.
Well, I think it costs so much money because the shipyards that are left are legacy shipyards. And so they're still dealing with means and methods that date back. As many of their labor contracts are legacy again, so they're allegedly more expensive. I think Aker is the first. No, maybe NASCO too. All these shipyards are, by the way, owned by foreigners. I don't know if that's a fact that is that well published or known, but our
I don't think it is.
No. Aker is owned by the Norwegians, Singapore, the Chinese own Halter. Bay is owned by the Italians. NASCO is the only commercial shipyard that I know, the big one, that is actually owned by Americans, the Crown family. So the only thing that's restricted in the Jones Act, and that's what we're trying to bring forward here, is the steel, the hull, and the superstructure. So NASCO on the tote ships, which are 3,000 TEUs, which are used either for the Puerto Rican, Hawaii, or Guam trades, or maybe Alaska, maybe a little big, but they will source the majority of the vessel from the world market. The engines may come from Korea. The navigation system may come from Germany. Propellers may come from Finland. That's allowed. So I've sort of kicked back at people that say it's more expensive to build in the United States. No, it isn't if you just build the correct way, or build the way that people build today in the world. So as soon as we start doing that, I believe that we'll do it better than anybody else, and people will be stunned at the fact that American manufacturing will overtake them.
These ships, let's stay on them for just one more second, just so in our listeners' mind, and even in mine, I can have, what do these intercoastal ships look like? It's obviously not a gigantic, Costco or Maersk vessel holding 18,000 TEUs. So what are we looking at here? What would you see on the water? How many containers can they hold?
To your subway example, they're between 300 and 600 feet, no more than 600 feet. There are thousands of different designs. They can take anywhere from 150 boxes to 450 to 500 boxes, 20s. So divide that in half. So you're dealing with a small asset. You're dealing with literally Federal Express truck size assets compared to a 747.
Sure. Makes sense. Makes sense. You mentioned something interesting. So your first routing is New York to Boston. How much time is that going to take me as a shipper to get my cargo from one port to the other on one of these vessels?
It takes about 20 hours max, loaded and unloaded. That's 263 miles, so you're doing 11 to 12 knots. Math gets you there, and then you have to load and unload. So OD pairs, origin destination, you've probably got a 20 to 22 hour cycle.
So there's nothing inherently time prohibitive about this, aside from, I guess, vessel scheduling and that kind of thing would really be, I guess, the time eliminator, but time on the water is relatively short.
That is correct, sir. But there's one little advantage if you're using imports and exports. Your box doesn't go into the stack. It sits on the K until it's lifted onto the mother vessel that's going overseas. So in many instances, it might be quicker because the terminal dwell time is significantly less if you're using short sea shipping than if you're using either truck or rail.
Well, if you've been keeping an eye on the ports, you know that a big issue at many of them are the lack of chassis, which is causing quite a bit of congestion because the truckers come, but they can't unload or pick up freight because there's nothing to put it on. So this seems like it would solve a bit of that issue as well, would it not?
Yes, sir, it would. Some people call it a problem. I think it's a little bit like chaos. Nobody wants to be in the chassis business, but we don't worry about chassis because our box goes from one dock to another dock. And what happens at the end of the docks, if you're going into Newark, you're going to go on a mother vessel. If you're going into Boston or New Bedford, you would have what we call a chassis pool, where we'd actually have chassis waiting to receive the boxes. And they bring boxes in and they bring boxes out on a defined route. Circular routes. So it might take golf balls from a Acushnet and bring something back to CVS as DC south to Boston. But that chassis would just run that route. It wouldn't be the mess confusion, I guess would be a better word.
We talked before, and you touched on it a little bit, but would this help U.S. infrastructure at all? I know that we've mentioned congestion with trucking, and if you follow the news, you know that there's a lot of crumbling infrastructure in the U.S., especially on highways and bridges, and there are a lot of areas that we need investments. How could pouring money into ports or smaller ports and facilitating intercoastal shipping be a benefit to infrastructure in the United States?
Great question. First, the ports exist. In many cases, you don't have to do anything. The ports are there. Just we're not using them. So to the land side infrastructure, which is struggling, according to the engineers, I guess we're down to D+ or whatever. What we're trying to do is to retask truckers from going from, let's say, to our example, from Boston to New York and then back. We want them to go from the Boston area to Conley, drop their load, pick up a load, go back. So they're operating within a very small area or a small distanced area. And that means that truck won't, or that truck container and chassis won't be going down 95 or 280 as the case may be to New York. That will relieve some of the pressure. It won't relieve all of the pressure, but it's a safety valve to move cargo from the highways to the water and then back to the highways. But the first mile and last mile are critical in short sea, but they're short distances. They're not long haul. So if you want to go from Maine to Miami with a load of timber, and you could do that, then that would mean that a truck wouldn't have to go all the way down the coast, the 1,800 and 1,900 miles along the highway. That truck would be eliminated from that route. The box would go, and then a truck would, or a technician would pick it up down in Miami and take it to the local destination where it's supposed to be going. So how does it help infrastructure? Well, if it adds capacity to infrastructure, it means that some of that capacity will flow to the water, which, by the way, costs nothing to create and very little to maintain. And that truck doesn't have to be on the road. So the infrastructure will get some relief, and it will have the transportation system will have increased capacity, And I think that the infrastructure, as we know it today, sort of taken out of the ER and put into a rehab center, will have a chance to rehab. And then I think the country will be fine. We've produced, believe it or not, only 1,600 miles of new highway since 1990. And that's a small amount considering, I think, some of the cargo numbers have gone up over 300%.
That's a pretty astounding fact that I'm sure many people would not know and would be surprised to hear.
Yeah, I think anybody that's been stuck in gridlock knows there's an issue. But that issue was, I think, the greatest opportunity of the 21st century. It just, to me, is we can do this. Challenged Americans usually find really creative solutions. Short sea shipping is in our blood, and once it takes hold, I think you'll see a lot of change in the patterns, Tim. I just think that's going to happen.
Now, your company, the name is GSL, and that stands for Green Shipping Line.
Shipping Line, right?
Yeah, so the green in there has an environmental component, right? Some listeners may not know this, but shipping is considered ocean shipping is considered the most environmentally friendly way to move cargo. It has a much smaller cargo footprint than, air, for example, which is very bad, and then trucks, which are not as bad as air, but much worse than seafaring vessels. So touch on that a little bit. Touch on the name, why you chose it, and what you think the benefit to the environment could be that some people may not be considering.
Well, we took it because it was green. You picked up on it. It's environmentally sensitive. Shipping is the greenest of all transportation modes. Water shipment, whether it's on a barge or whether it's on a container ship or whatever, is the greenest way of moving stuff from one point to another. So we pick green. We can measure the impact based on our calculator, which we call Magellan, which is modeled after the Marco Polo program in Europe, which they started in the 90s and finally came to a conclusion, and I think it was 06, Colleen, correct me if I'm wrong. 27 nations agreed on how to calculate the carbon footprint of a particular cargo, one container, let's say. We can measure how many tons of carbon are not emitted into the atmosphere. We, as a company, can. How many NOx, SOx, and particulates are not distributed or emitted into the atmosphere. We can give you accurate numbers on road and repair maintenance. SmartWay can do that too. That are eliminated by taking the truck off the road for that segment of the chain and putting it on the water. We can tell you statistically how many accidents are eliminated by not having that truck on the road and that cargo on the water. And we can also tell you the security element. And security is interesting because Puerto Rico was a pretty good example. Puerto Rico is an island. The only way to get things to them were ships. If we didn't have ships, in this case Jones Act ships, Puerto Rico wouldn't be able to get cargo from the United States. And I note with some interest that no other nation in the world has sent, to my knowledge, anything to Puerto Rico. Water, food, whatever. So we're sending all this stuff to our citizens. Nobody else is. So thank God we have some ships that can actually do it.
And to touch just back to your company one more time as we move towards wrapping this up, I met a few of your great team members behind the scenes as we were setting these things up, both Pat Roach and Colleen Robertson. They're very communicative, a joy to work with. But tell me about your team. Tell me where the company's at now and what kind of service people could expect now and in the future.
Well, where we are now is in the embryonic stage. We're working with several existing companies in the United States that could give us tonnage. We're working on the first vessel to be put into service, again, between New York and Boston. We're working on a program for the Great Lakes to move a certain cargo, which goes across the Great Lakes now to the automotive industry. And we're working with one of the large barge companies to bring our system to the rivers. And we hope within a year we'll have the services, those three, up and running. And we'll be back at people to try to get cargo, try to start changing the paradigm of this mode doesn't exist to yes, it exists, how do I use it?
And if people would like to learn more about Green Shipping Line, they can go to greenshippingline.com, correct? That's your landing page, your homepage. You have some information on there about what you aim to do, a little bit more on the Jones Act for people doing research. Again, I know it's a hot topic right now, so everyone should be informed.
Well, we try to make it a post board, and we like to hear from as many people as possible. There is a pull-down tab that shows you how ships are assembled. The particular ship that's being assembled in a shed, if you will, in the Netherlands is an example of what can be done in the United States. It's pretty straightforward. Pat tries to get as many articles on trucking as he can on the website. We're excited about the website because we think it's a portal for everybody to go to and then start the dialogue.
Percy, I think that there's a time and a need for it, and I think that the time is now. This is such a dense topic. There are issues in the environment, infrastructure, even automation that we don't really have time to delve in now without inundating people too much. But I would hope to have you back in the near future with some of your team members to maybe have a roundtable or a discussion with some of your principals on some of the greater outlook on this.
We can't thank you enough for this opportunity, Tim, and we would love to participate. We'd love to host anything that you would like us to do. We think this is a really important thing for the country, beside a very, very interesting commercial opportunity. And the more people that know what we're trying to do and start, even if they do it themselves, that's all right with us. We think it's a national objective. It's a national initiative. And we thank you again for being the first one who's really taken the opportunity to drill down into it in depth.
Thank you so much for your time today, and thank you to your team for help setting this up. Best of luck. We'll touch base in the very near future, and I look forward to seeing the progress that GSL makes in the marketplace.
We will keep you up to speed. Thank you so much.
Well, that was Percy Pyne of GSL. Intercoastal shipping. What's old is new again. A freight subway system. I'd like to thank Percy Pyne for coming on in GSL. Amazing stuff. As I mentioned at the top of the show in the pre-roll, we're going to be covering digital disruption, slave labor, container homes, ELDs, ransomware. Oh man, it's going to be fantastic. I'm going to have a ton of exciting guests. We have a guest almost every show this season. We're out on Mondays. We're the Shipping Pod. Info@theshippingpod.com to reach me. Theshippingpod.com to get our back episodes. Check us out on social media. We're the Shipping Pod there. At the Shipping Pod, Twitter, Instagram. Tons of cool photos on there. Highly recommend you go check it out. Thanks to our guests. Thank you to you, the listeners. If you get a chance, rate and review on iTunes. I am out of here for now. Until next week, take care and be well. This has been Tim Dooner for the Shipping Pod. Woo!
Where is this place we've come to? I don't know what to say. We long to see each other and are frightened of that day. You met me in a barren place. You walked me to the hill. We were so good for each other then. I know we could be still. You couldn't have come at a better time. You couldn't have come at a better time. You couldn't have come at a better time. Not if you tried. Oh no, not if you tried. Oh no. We had 500 questions between you and me. When you look into my eyes, my love, tell me what you see. Is it something you're not sure of, or something true and fine? Or is it just another case of the right face at the wrong time? couldn't have come at a better time. Ah, you couldn't have come at a better time. You couldn't have come at a better time. Since we were first together, at the lakeside sky so blue, we were so good for each other. Me and you and me and you and me and you. You couldn't have come at a better time. Ah, you couldn't have come at a better time. You couldn't have come at a better time. Not if you tried. Oh no. Not if you tried. Oh no. Ah, you couldn't have come at a better time. Ah, you couldn't have come at a better time. Ah, you couldn't have come at a better time. Not if you tried. Oh no. Not if you tried. Oh no. You couldn't have come at a better time. Ah, you couldn't have come at a better time. You couldn't have come at a better time. Not if you tried. Oh no. Not if you tried. Oh no. You couldn't have come at a better time.